He always thought the strangest thing he'd ever see on that mountain was the way the clouds sometimes broke apart at sunset, spilling gold down the cliffs like liquid fire. That was before he found the egg, alone in a dry riverbed, half buried in rock and dust, still warm to the touch. Later, when it finally cracked and the creature inside lifted its eyes to him, the boy realized something unsettling. The moment he chose to keep it alive, his life stopped belonging only to him. 1. Rowan Hale had been called Mountain Boy for so long that most folks in the valley forgot he had another name. He lived in a leaning cabin just above the tree line, where the wind hit first and hardest, and where the stars felt close enough to touch. The valley town below saw him sometimes when he came down for salt or nails, a skinny shadow with 2 big boots and a rucksack that looked older than he was. People said his mother ran off when he was small, and his father went into the snow one winter and never came back. No one asked him to confirm it. 2. On the day he found the egg, the sky was a clear, hard blue, the kind that made the mountains feel sharper, unforgiving. Rowan had followed a narrow trail along a dry gully, searching for firewood that hadn't already been soaked by spring melt. The snow was pulling back in ragged patches, revealing rock and broken branches and animal bones tossed aside by winter. He walked slowly, listening to the ticking meltwater and the distant call of crows. It was quiet in that peculiar way that made his skin prickle, like the world was waiting for something to happen. 3. He almost stepped on it, his boots scuffed against something smooth that didn't belong among the jagged stones. Rowan stopped, frowning, and looked down. Part of an egg. No, not part. The whole thing sat cradled in a nest of fractured rock, as if something big had once dropped it and the earth had tried to catch it. It was the size of a small barrel, mottled with gray and faint blue veining, surface dull, but somehow alive. He crouched slowly, fingertips hovering just above it. Warm. Not hot, but warmer than the air should have allowed. 4. Rowan glanced around automatically, expecting to see some enormous bird sweeping low overhead, some shadow moving at the edge of his vision. Nothing. Just wind combing the trees, the crunch of melting snow. "Where's your owner, then?" he muttered, brows drawing together. Eggs didn't just appear alone. They were guarded, fought for. He remembered stories his father used to tell by the fire, about old mountain birds big enough to carry off goats, about things the valley had chased into legend generations ago. He swallowed, throat suddenly dry. If any of those stories were true, he should walk away. 5. But he didn't. Instead, Rowan laid his palm flat against the shell. A faint vibration thrummed beneath his skin, almost like a heartbeat buried deep inside stone. The sensation sent a shiver through him, unsettling and strangely comforting at the same time. Whoever had laid this egg hadn't been gone long, or it was strong enough to hold warmth without help. Both possibilities made his pulse race. The practical part of him whispered about danger, about predators and hunters, and how small a boy was beside unknown things. Another quieter part whispered something else. It's alone, like you. 6. He sat back on his heels, weighing choices. Leave it where it lay, and the cold spring nights would do their work. A fox might come, or a curious village kid, or one of the men who liked trophies. If he tried to move it, he'd mark himself as part of whatever story this egg belonged to. He'd lived years avoiding other people's troubles, staying high in the hills with his chores and his ghosts. But he wasn't sure he could walk away. The memory of his father's face surfaced, tired, kind, and with it, a sentence he used to repeat. You don't turn your back on helpless things. 7. You picked a bad spot to be helpless, Rowan murmured. He slid his arms carefully around the egg, surprised at its heaviness. It resisted his grip like a stubborn boulder, but it shifted. He grunted, muscles straining, boots slipping on wet stone. Inch by inch, he got it up against his chest, locking his elbows underneath. The warmth seeped through his coat, a slow, steady heat that felt like standing too close to the stove. The sensation steadied him somehow. He took one breath, then another, then started the long climb back to his cabin. 8. The path felt steeper with every step. Snowmelt turned the trail slick, mud grabbing at his boots. Branches scratched his arms as he pushed through, using his shoulders to clear the way without jostling the egg. Twice he nearly lost his footing, and both times he twisted mid-fall to shield it with his own body, landing hard on his side or knee. Each time, the egg stayed whole, vibrating faintly like it was aware of the world tilting around it. Rowan's lungs burned, but there was a stubborn satisfaction in the weight he carried. Something in his life finally needed him. 9. By the time his cabin came into view, a weather-beaten shape pressed against the hillside, Rowan's arms shook like rattling boards. He shouldered open the door with a low grunt, kicked it shut behind him, and staggered to the hearth. The coals from last night's fire still smoldered weakly. He lowered the egg onto his father's old wool blanket, close enough to feel the heat, but not so close it might crack. His fingers tingled from the sudden release of weight. He flexed them, then crouched beside the egg again, studying it as if it might vanish if he blinked. 10. Up close, it was even stranger. Hairline cracks laced the surface, not the jagged breaks of something ruined, but the fine spiderweb fractures of something preparing to change. The blue veins pulsed faintly, in time with the vibration he'd felt earlier. Rowan reached out, traced one with a fingertip, then pulled back quickly, heart stuttering. Every instinct said this was bigger than him, bigger than his lonely cabin and quiet days hunting rabbits. He didn't know what would emerge from this shell, but he knew one thing. If anyone from the valley found out, they'd take it away. Or worse. 11. He tossed a few logs onto the coals, coaxing the fire back to life. As flames licked upward, orange light washed across the egg and the cabin walls, turning them the color of old stories. Rowan straightened, rubbing the back of his neck. "Well," he said softly, voice echoing oddly in the small room. "Looks like we're roommates now." The words shocked him with their own honesty. For years, his only company had been wind and birdsong and the creaking complaints of the cabin settling at night. Now another heartbeat pulsed in the room besides his own. 12. The next days fell into a strange rhythm. Rowan split wood, hauled water, checked traps, but every task orbited around the egg. He woke each morning and went to it first, pressing his palm to the shell. Still warm, still pulsing. He talked to it sometimes, in the quiet hours when the wind pressed against the walls and memory crowded too close. He told it about the father who taught him to track deer and read clouds, about the mother he barely remembered, her laugh as bright as melted snow, about the valley that looked at him like he was half wild. 13. At first, talking to an egg felt foolish, but the room didn't judge him the way people did. The shell drank in his words silently, blue veining brightening whenever his voice grew soft or his throat roughened. On the third evening, as the sun bled out behind the peaks, he swore he heard something inside, faint, like a tap, tap, tap from very far away. He leaned close, breath held. Again, 3 small taps, then stillness. "You hear me in there?" he whispered. No answer came, but the warmth under his hand deepened, He let out a shaky breath, half laugh, half sob. 14. The valley, of course, noticed nothing. When Rowan went down for salt and flour a few days later, no one asked why his shoulders seemed broader from carrying unseen weight, or why his eyes flicked instinctively toward the ridge whenever someone mentioned strange signs in the hills. At the trading post, old Mrs. Calder gossiped about missing sheep and odd scorch marks found up near the eastern cliffs. "Something big walking up there," she muttered, weighing his flour. "Mark me, boy, it's trouble." Rowan forced his face to stay blank, heartbeat jumping. "Probably just a cat," he said. 15. On his way back up the trail, he felt eyes on him. Not human. He knew that weight well enough, but something that flowed between trees like smoke. Twice he turned, scanning the undergrowth. Nothing. The silence had teeth, though, and they sank slowly into his back. Maybe there was something else in these mountains, something that had lost its egg. He tightened his grip on the sack of provisions and picked up his pace, boots crunching on gravel. The sun slanted low, turning the peaks into sharp silhouettes. Shadows stretched long and dark, following. 16. When he reached the cabin, the air inside felt charged, like the moment before lightning chooses where to strike. The egg sat exactly where he'd left it, but the fractures had deepened, thin lines now crisscrossing the shell like a map of forgotten rivers. The blue light inside pulsed brighter, spilling faint illumination across the blanket. Rowan closed the door gently, setting the provisions aside without taking his eyes off the egg. "Easy," he murmured, as if to a frightened animal. "I'm back. You waited, didn't you?" The shell quivered once in response, subtle but undeniable. 17. That night, sleep refused to come. Rowan lay on his narrow bed staring at the ceiling beams, listening to the small shifting noises from the hearth. Every crackle of wood sounded like another piece of shell giving way. Moonlight crept through the single window, painting a pale line across the floor. He gave up eventually, swung his legs over the side, and padded barefoot to the fire. The egg glowed softly, a steady heartbeat of light. He sat down beside it, wrapping his arms around his knees, and whispered, "What am I supposed to do with you?" 18. Memory answered him instead of the egg. His father, sitting in this same spot years ago, turning a mug between calloused hands. "Mountains don't give you what you want," he'd said. "They give you chances. What you do with them, that's on you." At the time, Rowan had thought he meant weather and hunting and small practical things. Now the words felt bigger, heavier, draped over the egg like an invisible cloak. This egg was a chance. To what, he didn't know. To have something of his own. To protect something fragile. To ruin everything. 19. Dawn came gray and reluctant. Rowan's eyes burned from lack of sleep, but his body felt wired, alive. He stepped outside briefly, letting cold air slap his face awake, then returned with fresh water and kindling. As he knelt by the fire, a sharp sound cut through the quiet, louder than before. A crack. He spun toward the egg. A jagged line had appeared across its surface, wider than the spiderweb fractures, like a river carving through rock. Another crack joined it, then another, each one echoing softly in the small cabin. Something inside pushed outward. 20. "Easy," Rowan breathed, heart pounding. He shuffled closer, hands hovering, unsure whether to help or stay back. The shell bulged from within, then split with a soft, wet sound. A sliver of light spilled out. Not white, but warm gold, like sunlight filtered through amber. The air filled with a faint smell of heated stone and rain-washed dust. For a moment, the world outside the cabin vanished. There was only the egg, the golden light, and the knowledge settling deep in Rowan's bones that whatever emerged next would bind itself to his life in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The first thing he saw was an eye, not like any he'd seen in foxes or goats or birds, but something older, clearer, with a slit pupil ringed in molten gold. It blinked slowly, trying to make sense of the light, then widened as it met his gaze. For a heartbeat, Rowan forgot to breathe. He'd braced himself for fear, a beast lunging, claws tearing, but what he saw instead was confusion, vulnerability. The same dazed look he'd worn the night his father didn't come home. His hands, which had been hovering uncertainly, lowered without him deciding to move them. More of the shell crumbled away. A small scaled head pushed free, slick with film that steamed when it hit the air. Horn nubs ridged the top of its skull, not yet grown into the dangerous points the stories spoke of. Its skin shimmered between slate and green, colors shifting with the firelight. Tiny nostrils flared, taking in the scent of wood smoke and wool and boy. The creature, dragon, his mind supplied with quiet shock, coughed once, a soft hoarse sound, sending a faint puff of warm vapor into Rowan's face. It smelled like heated stone after rain. Instinct told Rowan to step back. He stayed where he was. The half-born dragon wriggled, shoulders and chest forcing more of the egg apart. Wet membranes clung to its body, stringing from shell to scale. With each movement, more golden light poured out, until it seemed the cabin itself breathed with it. Rowan reached for his father's blanket, folded nearby, and gently draped it beside the egg. "Come on," he murmured, not sure whether he was coaxing a chick or welcoming a storm. "You're almost there." The dragon hesitated, then clawed its way forward onto the soft wool. The rest of the shell collapsed behind it with a dull clatter, pieces rolling like broken pottery across the floor. The dragon lay shivering, not from cold, but from the shock of being suddenly exposed to a world too big and bright. Its wings were small and half-folded, translucent edges trembling. Rowan bit his lip, suddenly terrified he'd done this wrong. Should he have left the egg where he'd found it? Should some other, larger creature have been here to greet it? But there was no one else. Just him and the thing the mountain had delivered to his doorstep. Carefully, Rowan dipped a cloth in warm water and wiped away the drying film from its scales. The dragon flinched at the first touch, then relaxed, eyes half closing as the warmth spread. Tiny claws flexed against the blanket. He worked slowly, murmuring nonsense words the way his father had once done when tending sick animals. "There you go, little trouble. That's it. World's not so bad once it stops blinding you." The dragon made a low sound that almost resembled a sigh. When he finished, its colors showed clearer. Deep greens, streaks of copper, faint constellations of pale specks. Hunger came next. Rowan saw it in the way the dragon's head snapped up when he reached for the small basket of food. Its pupils thinned, nostrils flaring. He broke off a piece of bread, hesitated, then remembered the trembling warmth in his arms the day he carried the egg. "Here," he said, offering the morsel. The dragon sniffed it, then took it delicately between tiny teeth. It chewed clumsily, crumbs scattering across the blanket. Bread vanished. Its gaze flicked back to the basket with almost comical intensity. Rowan huffed a quiet laugh. "Right. Growing already, are you?" He portioned out a little more. Scraps of dried meat, a sliver of cheese, keeping back enough to survive a few days himself. Every bite he gave away tightened a knot of worry in his chest, but watching strength seep into the dragon's movements unraveled something inside him too. When it finished, it stretched weakly, wings fluttering. Heat radiated from its body, chasing the lingering chill in the cabin. For the first time since his father's death, the room didn't feel too big for one person. It felt full, alive in a way that didn't depend on firewood. As the day passed, the dragon explored a radius no larger than a wagon wheel around the hearth. It moved cautiously, still unsteady on its legs, tail dragging lines through the ash-dusted floor. Every sound made it startle. A log popping in the fire, the wind rattling the shutter, Rowan's boots scraping. Each time it would glance back at him, as if checking he was still there. Every time he met its eyes and nodded, it settled again. A strange thought surfaced. It had no idea what he was, either. To it, he was just the first face after darkness. "We'll have to call you something," Rowan muttered that evening as he mended a tear in his coat. The dragon lay curled near the fire, head resting on its forearms, eyelids drooping. At his voice, it blinked slowly. "Can't just keep saying, 'Hey you,' every time you scorch something." He thought of names from his father's stories, terrible, ancient titles meant to frighten children into staying out of caves at night. None fit. This creature was no nightmare, not yet. Sunlight from earlier lingered in his mind, the way it had turned the egg's cracks to lines of gold. "Ember," he decided. "You'll be Ember." Ember yawned in response, a small arc of sparks curling from its mouth, harmless as fireflies. Rowan smiled, the word settling into the air like it had always been there. Naming made everything feel more real, more dangerous. You couldn't cast something aside so easily once it had a name. Names meant you had to care what happened next. As night drew in, he banked the fire and lay on his bed, watching the dragon's faint glow soften in the dark. The mountains outside loomed invisible but present, cradling this tiny, impossible secret in their stone arms. Days blurred into a quiet routine. Rowan hunted more often, pushing farther along ridges he usually avoided, driven by the need to feed two mouths instead of one. Ember grew fast, too fast. Within a week, its wings had strengthened enough to lift it briefly off the ground in awkward hops that ended with soft crashes into the bed frame or table leg. Each fall made Rowan flinch, but the dragon would shake itself, snort a puff of irritated smoke, and try again. Determination, it seemed, was not limited to humans in this cabin. The bond between them tightened with each shared day. Ember followed Rowan from hearth to table to door, like a shadow with scales. It learned his moods faster than any person ever had, nudging his hand when it sensed the heaviness that sometimes settled on him without warning, backing away when frustration flashed too bright in his eyes. More than once, while chopping wood outside, he caught himself glancing toward the window, expecting to see his father's broad shoulders framed in it instead of a curious dragon muzzle pressed to the glass. Of course, secrets tremble when they grow. It wasn't long before the valley began to murmur louder about strange signs on the slopes. Smoke, where no chimney stood, glows at odd hours above the tree line. Shepherd boys spoke of hearing distant roars at dusk, too high and clear to be bears. Rowan listened to these rumors on rare supply trips, keeping his expression carefully blank, his hands still. Inside, panic fluttered like trapped birds. Ember didn't roar yet, but something else was out there, or old stories were waking up because a new one had hatched. One afternoon, when the air tasted of thaw and wet moss, Rowan led Ember just outside the cabin for the first time. The dragon hesitated on the threshold, claws gripping the floorboards, nostrils flaring at the flood of scents, pine and rock, damp earth, the lingering ghost of snow. "It's all right," Rowan murmured, crouching beside it. "That's home, too." Slowly, Ember stepped out. Sunlight hit its scales, igniting colors he hadn't seen indoors. Bright turquoise along the spine, flashes of bronze on its flanks. It blinked, stunned, then lifted its head to the sky with a soft crooning sound that made Rowan's chest ache. They didn't go far that first time, just to the clearing by the split boulder. Rowan kept close, eyes scanning for movement, ears straining for any sound that didn't belong. Ember sniffed everything, tail whipping in fits of excitement. Once it pounced on a twig, shook it triumphantly, then looked up at Rowan as if waiting for praise. He laughed, tension easing. "Mighty hunter," he said dryly. Ember chirped, pleased. For a few stolen minutes, it felt like they were just boy and odd pet, nothing more. The mountain accepted them without comment, holding its judgments for later. Later came sooner than he'd hoped. That evening, as the sun slid toward the jagged horizon, painting the snowcaps orange, a different noise rolled up from the valley. A distant clamor, faint but unmistakable. Bells. Shouted orders. The ragged echo of horns they used only for hunts and emergencies. Ember stiffened instantly, head snapping toward the sound. Rowan's stomach dropped. He climbed onto a rock, squinting downslope. Tiny shapes moved like ants along the tree line. Men, clustered, armed. They were headed in a direction that made his blood run cold, toward the dry gully where he'd found the egg. "Someone else saw," he murmured, voice barely more than breath. Maybe scorch marks, maybe shell fragments he hadn't noticed. Maybe the mountain had its own way of whispering. Whatever the reason, the valley had decided something needed chasing. And people with spears and fear in their chests never stopped at the edge of a mystery. They'd push higher, asking questions, following signs. Sooner or later, they would follow them to him. Ember shifted anxiously, wings half spread, eyes reflecting the distant flashes of torchlight. For the first time, Rowan wasn't sure the cabin was a refuge. It felt like a trap. He paced the cabin late into the night, Ember's gaze tracking him. Options tumbled through his head. Hide the dragon in the root cellar whenever hunters passed. Hope they never noticed the scorch marks near his chimney, the claw scrapes on his door. Or leave. Take Ember deeper into the mountains, away from paths and men and anything resembling safety. Survive on whatever they could catch, sleep in caves, trade a roof for freedom. Each choice cost something. Each choice carried a kind of loneliness. But then, he thought, he'd been alone long before Ember came. The decision came the next evening, at sunset. Rowan stood outside, watching the sky bleed into gold and fire over the peaks. Ember perched on the boulder beside him, bigger now, nearly up to his chest when it stood straight. The dragon's scales caught the last light, turning it into a shifting, living mosaic. As the sun slipped lower, Ember suddenly lifted its head and opened its mouth, not in a yawn, but in something deeper. A note poured out, long and clear, somewhere between a call and a promise. It vibrated in Rowan's bones, echoed off the cliffs, rolled down into the valley. Torches sparked to life far below in answer, tiny flares against the darkening slopes. Rowan watched them flicker, his choice crystallizing as sharply as frost on glass. "They're coming," he said quietly. Ember glanced at him, eyes bright, unwavering. It stepped closer, pressing its warm side against his hip. In that simple lean, Rowan heard a truth. Whatever storm was heading their way, they would meet it together. He placed a hand on its neck, feeling strength coiled there like a rising flame. The mountain had given him a chance. just like his father had said. At sunset, with the first stars pricking the sky, Rowan Hale stopped being just the lonely boy on the ridge. He became the one who chose to stand between fear and wonder, and the creature at his side was what would change the valley's fate forever.